Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the second listening session of 3 that are going to be held last night in Andover, tonight in Wilmington, and tomorrow night in Tewksbury. The listening sessions concern the I-93 interchange and potential zoning for the area that will be able to be developed with a new interchange. We have with us this evening folks from our consulting team, Vanessa Hangen-Breslin. They're going to conduct the majority of the meeting. Ken Schwartz.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and for those who may be watching on television. We look forward to participating with you in this exciting project that we've got in front of us. As Carol mentioned, this is the second listening session that we're hosting. We had our first one last night in Andover, tonight in Wilmington, tomorrow in Tewksbury. In addition, there will be 2 charrettes, 2 work sessions coming up, so mark your calendars for these. The first one will be on October 22nd at Tewksbury Town Hall, and the second one will be on November 19th at Andover Town Hall. So the purpose of both the listening sessions and the charrettes are to solicit input, engage the public in establishing goals and development guidelines for the interchange area, the 700 acres of land that will be freed up and available for development once the interchange gets built. The purpose of these meetings are really to hear from you as to your goals, concerns, aspirations, things that you want to make sure that we take into consideration and address as part of both the vision plan as well as the form-based code that will be going before town meeting roughly a year from now. For those of you who are in the audience, we have provided you with yellow Post-its. During the course of our presentation, we've got about a 20-minute presentation, and then following the presentation, we'll open it up for questions and comments. But if there are particular issues, concerns that you've got in addition to the ones, or just to reinforce the ones that we hear from you tonight, we encourage you to write them, put them on the boards that we have here. You can see that there are a whole series of Post-its from last night's event that we held in Andover. We'll be incorporating these suggestions and concerns into the planning work as we move forward. So with that, I am going to turn it over to 2 colleagues here. Jeffrey Morrison-Logan is our project manager. He'll be giving you a brief overview of the process and the schedule. And then Mary Madden from Farrell Madden Associates is our form-based code expert who has worked on form-based codes throughout the United States and is on our team specifically to assist us in pulling together the form-based code for the Tri-Town area. So with that, Jeffrey.
Great, thanks, Ken. Well, it's great to be here tonight, and we're looking forward to the comments tonight from this group as well. So as Ken mentioned, I'll go through quickly a little bit of the background, the process that we're going to be going through to get us between now and the town meetings for 2010 in October. Tonight we're going to spend a few minutes talking about a little bit of the background material that Ken talked about. After that, from 6:50 to about 8 o'clock, we have topic discussion areas where we'll go through and get some feedback about the mixed-use development vision plan that was put together by others a few years ago. And then obviously with Mary being here, talking a little bit about how that translates into the form-based code and some of the elements that we're already starting to think about. And then at the end, we'll do the Post-it board exercise as well. A little bit about our team. You'll be seeing a lot of myself, Mary, and Ken. We're working very closely with the 3 town planners that are here in town, as well as Andover and in Tewksbury, and with a task force, the Tri-Town Interchange Task Force. We're meeting with them regularly as well. And we have a lot of in-house staff that's going to be helping us out with a lot of the technical side of this project as well. The process that we're going through, we've started about a month or 2 ago. It's about a 15-month process altogether. As I mentioned, it gets through to 2010 in October. We're very much still in the first part of this process, where it's called the discovery phase of work, and I'll go into that in more detail here. In the work plan and schedule, it's very much about understanding the issues, the opportunities, the constraints. We've had a series of kickoff meetings with stakeholders and with the task force itself. As we mentioned, these 3 nights this week are about listening sessions in each of the 3 communities. And we're also in the process of collecting a lot of data. There's been a lot of work that's been done in the past. We're building on that, getting our base maps together so that we can go off and do the work with the community. Stakeholders meetings, we've had about 20 of those all together with the landowners and key area stakeholders that are relevant to that area. So we've had those meetings a few weeks ago. And I mentioned the task force meetings that we'll have several of those scheduled throughout the course of our work. Public meetings, I'll go into a little more detail on that, but we have several of those structured throughout the next 15 months to get feedback as we develop the plans with everyone. First one's really about understanding the issues. That's really about tonight. Second one Ken mentioned was about this first charrette, where we're going to be defining the vision plan, getting into the mixed-use centers vision plan that came out a few years ago. The second charrette, which will be in November, is really getting into a lot of the details. What are the uses? What are the form of some of these places? And cartooning that with the community. And then in the spring and through the early part of the next summer, we're going to be getting into the draft and the final code, and we'll make several presentations as well. And regularly, we meet with the 3 town planners. We have weekly meetings with them and scheduled meetings when all the consultants teams are here, really to keep the project on task and on time. Coming up, there'll be a strategy session. The morning of the first charrette on October 22nd, we will be having a strategy session with the task force, and that's really about understanding how the form-based code and the different ways of applying this code, which you'll hear Mary talk about, really applies to that 700 acres of land, because there's several different ways of making that work here. So that'll be an important step as well. After that, we'll have the first charrette, as I mentioned. Between the first and second charrette is where we work to really define the vision plan, go back and drawing those details together as a team, so that come the second charrette, we have a lot for the public to respond to. So I think that's kind of a critical timeline in getting a lot of work done for us. And as I mentioned, in the spring, there'll be the draft and final form-based code presentations. Robertson and Cole is also part of our team. There's a kind of a legal side of how this gets adopted, the administrative side of how this works within the towns as well. They're helping out on understanding that whole part of the process. And then finally, it's building up the town meeting for the 3 different towns. We call this solidifying the consensus leading into that. And it's really about educating and informing what's in the form-based codes, how does it work, and so forth. We'll be meeting with the 3 different planning boards and having presentations there as well, and obviously a presentation at the town meeting. So getting there, here's a couple of key steps. We started a few months ago in August, as I mentioned. We had the stakeholder interviews a few weeks ago, and tonight and last night and tomorrow about the listening sessions, strategy sessions coming up on the 22nd, and all the red ones here where the key public events are going to be held as well. Second charrette, and on through into the spring where we have the different presentations about the draft and the final form-based code. And we're thinking for the final code, it'd be great to have the 3 different planning boards come together for a joint planning board hearing. That way we can hear together responses, feedback, and understand how we can move forward from there as well. And targeting when the warrant closings have to be put in place and leading up to the town meeting in October. We have a website as well where a lot of the information about reports and so forth in our timeline. It's www.vhb.com/try-town-FBC. So please look for that on the web. And tonight, as we mentioned, is really about listening, learning, and confirming about what the views and the perspectives are about the Unified Development Vision Plan. Again, this was done a few years ago. Understanding the opportunities, the challenges, and the priorities that come out of that. That's helpful to us as a team in advancing the work. So as we've been talking to people, we've been sharing a little bit about the background, because a lot of work has actually been done in and around the Tri-Town area over the last several years, and even up to the last 10 or 12 years. It started off with the interchange justification study, which really was the first study that identified potential options. Several alternatives came out from that emerged to the top, alternatives 3, 4, and 9. The constraints mapping, which that means basically identifying where the critical resource areas are, the wetlands and so forth. That's actually underway in each of the 3 towns. It's called an ANRAD process. That's helpful to us as a team to set where buildable areas are and where they're not within that 700 acres of land. As I mentioned, there's the Tri-Town Unified Development Vision Plan, this mixed-use centers vision plan. That's providing us the framework of how to envision future development on that site, and I'll walk through that in just a minute. And as part of that process, there was a visual preference survey that was done to understand the type and character of development within the land use areas that you'll see in a minute. And there's 3 regional planning agencies that are working with the towns to understand, based on existing zoning and existing overlay districts, what's the potential build-out of this area. And there's another firm called AECOM. They are working on the environmental impact study that's part of looking at the interchange itself, the options around the interchange, and that process is well underway, and that's going to be going through next year. So a lot of stuff's happening here, a lot of stuff that we need to be coordinating with as we go forward. Spend a few minutes here on this diagram. This is the mixed-use center's vision, unified development vision plan. And in here, as I mentioned, this is going to be forming the framework for us as a team to start thinking about development and the form-based code. So what I'm going to do is spend just a few minutes, orient people here. The colored area in the middle of this diagram represents the approximate 700 acres of land. What was identified in the different colors here are different land use goals, development goals. So in number 1, which is the yellow on the screen, towards the top, that's identified as high-tech life sciences. In 2, which again is at the very top and down at the bottom in the greenish color, is open space goals along the Shawshene River to the north and down in Wilmington to the south. The reddish colors are targeted for retail areas, and there's a light blue color, number 4 in there, next to I-93, which bisects this whole area. That's identified as these mixed-use centers. And 5 is where the landfill site is, the Superfund site over in the Tewksbury area. That was identified for environmental remediation. 6, down towards the bottom in the pinkish color, was identified for office and research and development. And closest to the highway, where number 7 is, was targeted for hotel and conference center. And you also notice there's a couple of circles on there. The one that's to the upper right is along the commuter rail line that goes to downtown Boston and North Station, that identified at least the potential for future transit connections to it and maybe an additional train station along the line. What's also important, in these prior documents, they've identified the town's priorities. This was done, again, a couple of years ago, but from Andover's perspective, it was about getting access to this new interchange was very important. Traffic and safety improvements to the existing residential areas up to the north as well. Economic development in terms of tax base and jobs. And knowing that the Shawshene River runs by on the north side there, having active and passive and conservation uses along the Shawshene River was identified through that town. Tewksbury priorities, again, interchange access to I-93, but limiting the access out to the west where South Street is. Economic development, again, tax base was a priority, but no housing was what they underscored there. And the environmental remediation, as I mentioned, there's a Superfund site there, so that was part of their goals. For here in Wilmington, goals that came up were, again, increasing the tax base was a priority, no negative impact or change in maintaining the existing infrastructure that's here, and impact neutral change to the traffic flows. So with that, I'm going to hand off this, and maybe, Mary, you can talk a little bit about how form-based codes apply, a little bit about what they are, because I know there's a lot of questions that have come up in the people that we've been talking to today about what are they, how do they apply, what goes into it, and I think Mary's portion of the presentation will answer a fair amount of those questions. So,
sure. Thanks, Jeffrey. Good evening, all of you here tonight. I'm going to just talk a little bit about form-based codes. Some of you may have heard of form-based codes before and have a sense of what they are, and other people maybe have never heard this term before. At the end of the day, it really is a tool for regulating development. And what we like to talk about is how does it differ from the way we regulate development in conventional zoning. There are really 2 big aspects. Conventional zoning, I will touch on this a little bit more as I move forward, but today it typically focuses on land use. We have retail, we have commercial, we have residential. That could end up in a variety of different characters and forms. Everyone here might picture something different if you say this is going to be retail development. Form-based codes really approach it differently. They say we're going to create a place. We're going to create places with specific character, and then work from that end goal to say what are the developed standards that we need to have in place to produce the type of character development that we want. Another aspect of form-based codes is really different than conventional zoning is form-based codes include the public realm, the public spaces. Most zoning codes just deal with regulating private development. Things like streets and sidewalks and parks are regulated in different parts of the city or town ordinances. So with form-based codes, you're looking at how those pieces come together to create the overall place. Around the country, a lot of communities are starting to look at form-based codes, and people, this is from On Common Ground, the Realtors magazine, talking about smart growth, and what even on the realtors side of things, the private sector has recognized. People across the U.S. are complaining about sprawl and spending too much time in the car, and everyone says, why do we keep building this way? Well, at the end of the day, most of the development that we see coming out of the ground is built according to our existing zoning. So the task with form-based codes is really to think about those standards differently. Why don't we code for what we want instead of creating all these places that at the end of the day we say we don't like? Just to sort of illustrate this, there's a cliche, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So a lot of towns and communities have comprehensive plans, we have vision statements, and we say this is what we aspire to be. We also then have regulations that may or may not deliver the visions that we say we want. An example of this is from a comprehensive plan in California. If you all read this, everyone here may envision something different. Infill and develop in existing urbanized areas, build affordable multifamily housing near transportation corridors. So you might imagine what that's going to be. Here's one illustration. Maybe that's what you were thinking of, maybe it's not. But you can see there's affordable housing, multifamily, whether it's apartments or condominiums. You see it's a transportation corridor, there are buses there. And you think, yeah, this is a great place. I could see living here, I could see working here. The interesting thing is this image is a computer simulation. This is not a real place. However, this is the real place that was built. And if you read the statement and look at this picture also fulfills that vision statement. And you wonder, why do we develop this way? Well, most communities, the development regulations control almost everything in this picture. They say how tall the buildings are, how far they set back from the road. There are requirements for what the turning radii are so that the fire trucks can get around the corner without slowing down. They may say that you have to have 2 turning lanes here because we have so many cars we have to move through, ignoring the fact that it really makes it virtually impossible for a pedestrian to get across the street. And interestingly, even most zoning has landscape regulations. So the trees, the berm there that's around the apartments, it's probably required because you have to buffer the apartments from the roadway. So you look at this picture and say, we're regulating everything here, but why is it that we say we don't want this kind of development in our towns? So the task for us is to think, what is the place that we want? How do we set the rules to achieve that place? We still need to work with the traffic engineers and make sure we're getting in trees and landscaping, but make sure all the pieces come together to create an overall place. I mentioned that most of our zoning conventionally focuses on land use. In conventional zoning maps, the red represents the retail category. So you might say this is retail, this is red on a map. Interestingly, this would also be red on the map. But if you think as a person experiencing this environment, these are really 2 different places. Even though the regulations say this is X square feet of retail, my business partner likes to say, if they both have a Starbucks, you can buy a $5 cup of coffee in either place. But otherwise, they're fundamentally different places for the human experience. Another tool that we use in conventional zoning a lot, you may or may not have heard of, is the floor area ratio. Planners like to talk about the FAR. And it sounds like it's very precise and specific. People will say, I only want an FAR of 1.0 or 0.5. Well, at the end of the day, it's also a very blunt instrument. You could see how this diagram is. You could have 1.0 mean you cover 100% of the land with a 1-story building, or it could mean you cover 10% of the land with a 10-story building. That would produce the same FAR. So we always encourage communities, don't get focused or fixated on an FAR number, which at the end of the day can really produce very different results. But there's a temptation, because it sounds like it's so precise, to hang on to something and say we only want FAR of 1.5 or 0.75. Another aspect I just want to touch on is that a lot of people say, well, let's just use our existing zoning and then use design guidelines, because we're really just worried about how the buildings look. And I would encourage you to think beyond that. It's more than the way the buildings look. That's part of it, but it's actually the way the buildings function, how they create a place. You may or may not be familiar with this building, Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson. It's in Albemarle County, Virginia, a rural area in the middle of the state. It's also the home of the University of Virginia. The community has a mixture of rural and urban areas. It has the nice downtown, educated population. They have very strict design review. They have a board of architectural review. And in Albemarle County, they're very concerned about the corridors in and out of town. And so a developer came in, he had a project that was going to produce jobs and produce sales tax revenue, and he had to go before, or she had to go before the architectural review board. And they really didn't like the design. And they said, well, you know, think about Virginia architecture and the style and design and aesthetic that we have. We use a lot of red brick. We think you should consider, you know, making your building red brick. Developer goes away, comes back, changes the design. The story is that they were sent back about half a dozen to a dozen times to fix the design to meet the Board of Architectural Review. They were told that they needed to have a portico or columns, but they said that's really too much, but if you can at least get pilasters, you know, what look like columns on the building. And we would like you to have pediments, so the triangle above the door that you show, this is the entrance. Well, the developer kept reworking their design, time, money, engineering to get it redone. At the end of the day, on Route 29, outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, this is what they got. Some people say this is the most expensive Toys R Us in the U.S. outside of the one in Times Square in New York City. They dealt with how the building looks, the building materials, decorative elements, but at the end of the day, it's still a big box sitting in the middle of the parking lot. You can really deal with how a building looks and still not have the form that you want to create the place that you want. We always joke and say that this actually, you could argue, is even mixed use, because there's residential component up on the hill. So if you know how to mountain climb or rappel, you could actually go out and go down the big retaining wall and walk over to the Toys R Us and, you know, do your Christmas shopping. But at the end of the day, this really isn't a form. It's not a people place. It's a big box out on a commercial corridor. Just a quick overview. When you regulate development, we talk about three big categories. The physical form, somebody is going to build something somewhere. The use and density, which conventional zoning today really focuses on. What's happening inside the building, how much can go on a parcel, so you overall are dealing with units per acre, or FAR, and then management. What are the policy decisions? Do you allow on-street parking? When does the garbage get picked up? Are people allowed to serve alcohol or not? That's another part of overall physical development. In most communities today using conventional zoning, they really focus on use and density. They deal with the management, the public policy issues. If they address form at all, it's often an afterthought. Sometimes it's even an unintended consequence. What you get left with the building is just what's not been covered by all the other regulations. In a form-based code, you really kind of turn that on its head. You say, what is the physical form? What do we want to see people develop? Let's make that really clear. We're still going to have to deal with the management, the public policy issues. We're still going to have to make decisions about, when the garbage gets picked up, that sort of thing. We don't completely ignore use. We still have some restrictions and controls on use. Everything can't go everywhere, but we put it as a lower priority. It's still regulated, but it's not the first thing we look at. This is just an illustration. This is a commercial corridor. It could be pretty much anywhere in the U.S. It's actually outside of Washington, D.C. in an older suburb. Very regulated, strict zoning here, and this is what you end up with. Not a very nice place. The buildings aren't vacant. People are making money here, but it's not really a people place. With a form-based code, you really step back and you say, what is the framework? What are the rules we want for development to follow here? Let's put the rules in place so the private sector knows what we expect them to do. Make sure that if they're going to come in and develop, they can still make money. If the private sector can't make any money, they're not going to develop. But we want to make sure the rules are there. Here's the public space. Here's the general form of the buildings. And then you leave it to the private sector to say, this is how we're going to design the individual buildings. This is what the look is. This is what our program is. But you've got the framework in place for the overall location. Or we can just keep regulating the way we're doing now, parcel by parcel, use category by use category. I'm going to run through a bunch of examples here very quickly, conceptually just sort of illustrating the idea of what do we really mean form versus use. Looking at broad categories of building types or land uses and how they might be configured differently. Retail. We all talk about retail, but what form might it take? Big strip centers, big box, or might it be more a walkable sort of town center or village center environment? Parking. We all know we have surface parking lots as one option, but if we talk to moving towards structured parking, if you're really trying to create compact development, what does that mean? If you do parking structures bad, nobody really wants something like this in the heart of their town or in their village center. But is there a different way to think about structured parking? Does it have to just be this raw structure out on the sidewalk? You can think about combining parking structures. This one is combined with a residential component. The lower two levels are parking and the upper levels are condominiums. Similarly, if you're looking at creating a village center or retail shopping district, you might put shops on the ground floor and the structured parking is above. People walking by on this street are not aware that's a parking structure, but it makes sure for the people shopping that there's plenty of place to park. Another example, apartments. I didn't say this before, I want to say this. These are just thinking about big uses and different ways that they can be formed, not saying these are specific examples for Wilmington or Tewksbury or Andover. A lot of communities develop apartments just like this today. 3 stories, walk up, it's affordable housing for young families. It's a way to accommodate a lot of people. It also actually uses a lot of land. It's sitting in the middle of a parking lot. What if you thought about apartments as being part of a neighborhood, around a street in a block pattern? Maybe this actually has more units, less units, but it's a different character even though the actual land use might be the same. Smaller apartment buildings, again, fitting into a neighborhood structure. How does the building relate to the street and the public space? So it's not an apartment complex in the middle of a parking lot. Again, townhouses. In some communities, townhouses are a way for new families to become first-time home buyers. They're also a way for people who are ready to give up their single-family house on an acre lot to still have their own house, private home ownership. How would a townhouse be formed? How could it be formed? Interestingly, this is the front of these townhouses. 20 units per acre. It's in a pretty new development. Prince William County, Virginia. This is in the same development, same zoning, same density, 20 units per acre. Fundamentally different form. How does it relate to street? How are the windows and doors addressed? Is there a sidewalk? Would you like to walk there? Or could you even go another step further? Still 20 units per acre, but maybe you say, you want to have porches, or you want to make sure that there's a common public open space, usable green space that's part of the development. Statistically, all these townhouses could be exactly the same on paper, 20 units per acre. But if you actually regulate the form, you can create a different character of place. Mixed use. A lot of people are talking about mixed use. The unified vision that came out a couple of years ago talks about mixed use centers. What does that mean? In some locations, it means putting the shops on the ground floor, having apartments, condominiums above, having offices above. But it can also mean putting an apartment complex next to a strip center. So what's the physical form of mixed use that you're envisioning? What's the character of a mixed-use center for the Tri-Town area? This is a station landing here in Massachusetts. Again, having some shops downstairs and offices or residential above. What's the character of the place? What should the rules be to create the place that the Tri-Towns see for themselves? And then last but not least, the same thing comes into play with open space. There's a lot of the big land use diagrams we showed you, the mixed use vision plan has some large areas designated as open space. Well, what does that mean? Is it leftover green space between the highway and the parking lot? Or is it actually designed, usable space? Maybe it's actually designed like a quiet park that you would walk through with places to sit. Maybe it's a small green space in front of some residences or offices, but again, it's usable space. Maybe it's maintaining some natural areas as preserved, but also creating bike paths or walking paths, so you have a really passive, nice space. Maybe open space is hardscape, plaza. There's a lot of different ways to think about that. Bringing the pieces together. I talked about the form-based code deals with the public space, the streets, and the buildings. This is Arlington, Virginia, outside of D.C. Again, this road could be just about anywhere in the U.S. It's mixed use. It has residential, it has retail, it has some offices. This road actually carries about 30,000 vehicles a day, most in the morning and in the evening rush hours. It has sidewalks, but you can see there's a lot of curb cuts. You rarely will see anybody walking along here if they have any other option. About 10 miles away, another D.C. suburb, Alexandria, Virginia. Interestingly, this road carries more traffic than the other. This carries about 40,000 cars a day, 6 lanes, 3 in each direction. But you can see the buildings relate to the street. There are generous sidewalks. You might say, well, that's fancy architecture. But if you really look at the buildings, they're pretty simple, straightforward red brick buildings. In this image, most of these are not even that old. But it's, again, dealing with how the buildings relate to the street, creating the pedestrian environment, making sure that people feel comfortable walking. Here they actually allow parking on the outside lanes at non-rush hour. So it's really a different environment. It's an overall place. Whereas in this one, you might say, you know, there is no there. You don't think of, I'm going to go to this location on Columbia Pike. Just real quickly, part of what we're doing is working through what is the character you all want for the Tri-Town interchange area as new development comes online. If the interchange is going to happen, there's going to be development happening. So what should it be like? Not uniform character across the whole 700 acres. We sense from the unified vision and then the work we've done so far that there will be different character types within the area. What are the standards need to be to really bring that kind of character development into being? How do the pieces fit together? How do you make the connections or the transitions between the open space or the mixed-use centers or the research high-tech development? How do those pieces actually transition? So the big idea is to move the regulations from being oriented towards density and FAR and say, what's the character of a mixed-use place? What are the standards we need to put in place to create this Tri-Town district? Jeffrey.
Great. So that was it pretty much for us tonight in the presentation portion. So what we've been asking people as we've been talking about this over the last few weeks is really getting more familiar with your thoughts about the mixed-use development vision. What are your interests in the 3 towns, going down this path of getting to a form-based codes? Are there specific benefits that people see about applying them here? And as we're going to be developing this over the next about year or so, going forward from right now, are there challenges in developing it with the community that we should be thinking about and planning for? And even when it comes to the implementation side, if you're thinking about how would someone develop this, are there certain things that we need to talk about or think about and how it would be developed over time? So with that as a framework, we have the study area map over here, we have the mixed-use vision plan over here. Mary Ken and I and Carol too, if you want to jump in and help out with answering some of the questions here, we'll go through and help facilitate that discussion tonight. And just to point out people on the map here, this is our study area map. It's also available on the website as well. We have 2 areas that are denoted here. There's a yellow line that falls within the area. That's the focus of where the form-based code is likely to be applied. There's a red area which is more of a planning contextual area, so planning, knowing what's happening next to your neighbors across the street. So the red area is really about planning context, but the form-based code is really limited to the yellow area. And we expect that will be slightly tweaked as we go through the next few months as we understand specific parcel lines and so forth, but that's where the focus of our effort is. So with that, we really just wanted to open it up to questions about any of these and go from there. So questions for tonight, thoughts, comments on any of these items here?
Everyone is speechless. Oh.
First, I suppose. Yeah, thank you, first of all, for coming here, and Carol, thanks for putting this together. Form-based code is a neat term. I've never heard it before, to be honest with you, so I was really anxious to get a definition, and that your definition goes beyond defining, because you hit the nail on the head. Pictures. It's all about pictures for me. The difference between some of what I saw and some of those images, where effectively they followed the same code, but you got very different environments, very different places. The gist that I got was, well, I liked the better place. I think we probably all did in the room. That looks better. I'll take that one. But the better looking places, to me, look expensive. So I started attaching in my head expense equals form-based code is going to drive us towards big, not necessarily big, but more expensive construction, more expensive development. It's going to be more costly you talked about like some low-income housing, but I guess that is to be defined as well. So that was one question that jumped out in my head. And you can talk to that a little bit, I suppose, a little bit more. One of the other questions that came up, not necessarily related to form-based code, and maybe we can migrate towards this, but as this development takes place, one of the things, and I guess, again, I'm always thinking about cost, is cost to the town for public safety provided to that region by the Wilmington Public Safety professionals. If Wilmington is to be expected to respond to emergency situations that occur, I guess mostly to the southern sections of this region where we have property that's on, or I guess where our land goes onto it.
Yeah, I can point that out real quick. The Wilmington area is down over here within that yellow area as well. And that there's a lot of wetlands and so forth and constrained land access to that area down here.
Okay. And I'm not asking a question necessarily. I'm just thinking down the line and into the future, and maybe this is questions that have come up before and I haven't heard the answers to. But how or what should we expect will be our future for public safety once this land is developed? And I imagine there will be some concerns for the people of Wilmington over whether or not to build substations and fund that, and how do we fund that? And lastly, that came into my brain was, there's 3 towns involved, and one would make the assumption that that there are burdens in some cases associated with some of the development that will go on there, but also there's great advantages potentially for a lot of the development that can go on there. The advantages can be building a beautiful place. It could be tax revenues. It could be any number of different advantages that could come. I guess I want to make sure, and my desire would be that Wilmington suffers only 1/3 of the pain if we're going to enjoy, and we want to ensure that we enjoy 1/3 of the pleasure, so to speak. So that's all I wrote down, and I'm sure I'll have more if it comes up, and I entertain your responses if there are any, and I hope that other residents here will chime in.
Who wants to go first? You mean to jump on the first one and
Sure.
then everyone? Interestingly, someone asked a similar question last night in Andover about, the nicer pictures look more expensive. What does that mean? And there are 2 pieces. Obviously, if you're striving for a higher quality of development, it could have higher costs. One of the things that we've seen in a lot of communities where we've worked is partially tied to the process and administration as much as the new standards. I don't know exactly what the development review process is here in Wilmington, but in a lot of places, if it's long and drawn out, developers have told us they would rather spend more on improving the quality of their project and less on a long drawn-out development review process, paying for attorneys for 24 months to take them through a process, or, dealing with unknowns. If they get something designed, at the end of the day it doesn't get approved. if they know very clearly up front, here's what I'm expected to do, I would rather put the money into the actual development than in dealing with the administrative process. Now, obviously, that's an anecdotal answer to your question, but we've seen it in several communities that have limited land area and where going through the development process is expensive. Another aspect of this, and kind of ties into, there's economies of scale, but there's also the idea, and I haven't delved into you all's development regulations. In a lot of communities say you have minimum sizes. And so minimum sizes drive up the cost on one hand, and if you give some flexibility, the townhouses that I showed that did have some porches near the end, the interesting thing that you can't see in that picture, those townhouses themselves within that development are a variety of sizes. So some of them were as small as 1,000, 1,200 square feet, and some of them were as big as 2,400 square feet. And so within the development, the designer and the developer had some flexibility within the standards so he could achieve a range of affordability, a range of choices, and not just say, well, if everything has to be above a certain minimum standard, then you can't really provide a more affordable unit unless you go to the cut rate and just say, well, I need to build 400 units in order to make the economics work out. I don't know if the rest of you want to touch on it a little bit more.
Just to say a couple of things about the permitting process, and I've already lost the second one. We'll talk about the permitting process first. One of the requirements of the development project that we're undertaking here through the state is under Chapter 43D, which requires the communities to adopt what is called an expedited permitting process. I think what you find is that developers crave predictability. If they know what they're going to face, if they know what the requirements are going to be, if they know what the time frame is, it helps tremendously keeping down the cost of the preliminary cost of development. So the program that we're working through, the funding for our being able to do this planning process, requires us to adopt an expedited permitting process that defines the predictability for developers of time spent in the development process. We've done that. The 3 towns have reviewed their regulatory process. We can conform to the timeframes and the specificity that the state has asked us to. The second issue here is we're dealing with 3 towns, 3 geographic locations, all having 3 sets of zoning bylaws at this particular point in time. One of the reasons for going through this form-based process, in addition to the benefits of defining place as opposed to use, is that we can also build into this some conformity in our requirements so that in this area of the 3 towns, the rules for the developers are all the same. Again, that feeds into their ability to predict outcome and hopefully reduce upfront costs.
And I would speculate, what I've seen somewhere else, just following up on what Carol said there, is in some places, if the rules are really different, you get the developer sort of potentially playing one community off of the other, and so it will help, I think, benefit the communities if they know we're all going to hold the developers to the same standard, so they're not going to go, what I say, the cliche is, race to the bottom. We want to go build where we can build the cheapest development possible. We know within this tri-town area, the standards are going to be the same, so the quality of development required of us, the towns have made clear, this is what the expectation is.
On the border of Wilmington and North Reading, several years ago, a parcel of industrial land was developed. There's probably 5 or 6 acres that live in Wilmington. The rest, which is substantially more, lives in North Reading. The developer because he had to bring his package to both Wilmington and North Reading, chose to put all of the development, all of the tax resources, all of the revenue in North Reading. It was easier, only one set of rules, one set of standards. So Wilmington, while they had a nice piece of land that would have held a very nice industrial building, lost out. Nothing was built in town.
Just to follow up on your other question about public safety, we heard similar comment last night in Andover, and I'm sure we'll hear the same in Tewksbury. And clearly, it's a concern, it's an issue that needs to be addressed, and we'll be meeting with and coordinating our work with police and fire departments in each of the 3 towns. So we'll be exploring that and looking at that as part of this.
Other questions or comments?
Well, the last one, so we don't ignore it, and we
Right.
kind of touched on it,
Oh.
the burdens and advantages that it should be shared, and as far as the form-based code standards that we're focused on, that would be absolutely understood. Some of that ties again, I think, into the agreement between the towns, Carol, the administrative process and the commitment from all the towns that's sort of the idea, I think, why the Tri-Town Task Force was sort of brought together initially is the interchange is going to happen and we should all benefit and we should all share the cost, so.
I think that's sums it up very nicely. We do have some intermunicipal agreements between the 3 towns as to how we're going to behave when we're sitting at the table. We do also have an agreement among ourselves that if everyone can't agree, then one veto means a particular portion of the project doesn't go forward. So I think we're trying very hard to make sure that no one suffers while someone else gains.
Are there other comments, questions? One question that I'm curious about, and we didn't sort of put it in here, is it is 3 towns. But for the town of Wilmington, those of you who are here, how do you see this area in the interchange study area relating to the rest of Wilmington? Character-wise, connection-wise, political-wise, just big picture. How is this part of the rest of Wilmington? How is that? How does it feel? It's a big sort of philosophical question, but it ultimately can have very specific implications.
Well, I guess I'll be first again. Me and my big mouth. I have a hard time answering that specifically. Well, how do I see it? How do I not see it is easier for me.
Okay.
So maybe I can build
That's
up
fair.
to that. And I want to be cautious as to not say anything negative about our existing shopping areas, which are great, and I use them frequently. However, I don't envision, I hope that the future of this region is not BJ's, Walmart, Target, Toys R Us. All fine establishments, and I use, I guess, enough of that in this region is what I see, up and down the 93 corridor, and even within our own community. So I guess from that, where do you go? I saw some beautiful pictures, and I think of, and I don't know if you all are familiar with it, but I think of Pickering Wharf in Salem. Admittedly, we don't have a wharf here. Can we build a wharf?
That's, I think, a little outside the...
No, a lot of water on shoot high. No, but in all sincerity, I mean, that's I don't know if that's considered mixed use, but I know that there are residential areas that are above retail and restaurant communities, and it's a walking area, and I think there's some open area. To me, that's something that I think we're lacking in Wilmington, or at least in this region, and I envision that as beautiful and useful, and something that is not currently already in place. I also wonder, how much more retail can this region take? Are there enough stores, and we all hear about the economy and stores shutting down and closing down, there's not enough business, times are tough, et cetera, and we're talking about the possibility of adding dozens of stores and another hotel, and, you know, that's fine, I'm not an expert in these areas, maybe there is enough business for all those businesses. Those businesses are the ones that will determine that. But it would be a shame to blaze forward with the assumption that companies and corporations are going to step up to put their businesses there, and then we come to find out that they're not ready to do that. So, I don't know, I didn't necessarily answer that question, but I hope that we're not tiptoeing our way into the Walmart nation in North Wilmington. Anybody else?
I know some of you have opinions on this.
I think some of the development in Wilmington in that area, a lot of it is industrial. And potentially bringing some services or amenities to that area for the folks that work there would be an improvement. All of the buildings on Ballardvale Street specifically are pretty much single story. The potential there for additional uses, for redevelopment in a different manner is probably there. Manufacturing is suffering badly everywhere. And so I think providing property owners in that area with options is probably one of the more important tools that I see this project potentially resulting in.
Yes.
Yeah, I had a question about what the final product might be. If residential is included in your final, proposal for the code, does 40B come into play, and will that have an impact, even though you make a certain number of recommendations and they're all approved by the 3 towns? But if a 40B developer comes in and decides to develop one of the areas that you designated residential, would that override, or could that override your recommendations?
Do you want me to jump in or?
Go ahead, and I'll join the question.
We did have a similar question last night, and none of us across here are attorneys, so we just want to state that. My understanding is at the fundamental baseline, 40B would override if Wilmington or Andover or Tewksbury has not hit the 10% threshold. The interesting concept, and we do have a legal component on our team, and I think we'll be exploring this as we move forward, and someone in Andover specifically asked this question. There is another standard, 40R, that would enable communities to proactively say, we have designated areas where we want to achieve the workforce housing, the affordable housing. And my understanding is that 40R expressly talks about form-based codes, so that there could be a chance strategically for the Tri-Town area to consider using the 40R tool to, I don't know what the right word is, but basically put you all in a position so that someone couldn't just walk in and use the 40B, because my understanding is if you have the 40R plan in place, then it can be used, counterbalance isn't the right word, but offset exactly what someone could do with 40B, because you have already proactively planned for the type of housing that it's supposed to encourage. As I said, I am not an attorney, and it's something that I think we want to really look at a little bit more strategically. Does that make sense for us to really accommodate the 40R rule within the form-based code specifically?
And I think it also just depends on, from 3 different towns' perspectives, about what their goals are for housing as a potential component and where they are on their affordability. How much are they providing in each of those 3 towns? And is this something that's in part of this process, or something that maybe comes shortly thereafter this process is adopted? So
Right.
I think we'll look into those as well.
I'm not a Wilmington resident, I'm with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, but my interest is representing Wilmington's interest in our council, and also in general, the whole topic of form-based codes. Could you tell me a little bit about how form-based codes intersect with the kinds of regulations such as for low-impact stormwater management? Because there's a lot of interest in that, but sometimes there are portions of traditional zoning codes as well as a whole host of other regulations that all, apply to low-impact development or not. And is there any particular emphasis these days on how a form-based code can, advance those kinds of goals?
That's a very question.
Well, I think there is definitely, it can be incorporated within the form-based code. Okay, let me preface that again. We'll be working with the attorneys to make sure legally what we can include within form-based code, which has to fall within the enabling legislation for zoning. But conceptually, it definitely can. One of the benefits of thinking about the overall character of the place as opposed to going parcel by parcel is to work through what sort of things, such as stormwater, can be managed more on on a shared basis as opposed to every parcel trying to fulfill everything on site. Because interestingly, one thing that people are starting to realize when they're talking about low-impact development, but also smart growth and compact walkability and that sort of thing, is sometimes the low-impact development standards can be working in direct opposition to creating compact walkable places if the only way you can meet those standards is by spreading things out and doing rain gardens and that sort of thing. So what we would probably be looking to, and this is just off the top of my head here, is looking at more in the mixed-use center, what would be the standards that are sort of more on the urban, or I'm not supposed to use that word, but on the compact, the sort of, if you're actually talking about a walkable place with sidewalks and that sort of thing, how would you handle stormwater in that situation as opposed to being on a research campus, so having swales and rain gardens would be more appropriate for the character of that place. So there are actually sort of degrees of different ways to design and manage stormwater that fit with the different character places. We wouldn't, I think, want to try to just say across the board we want to incorporate rain gardens and swales and that sort of thing, because it's not going to be the same character everywhere. You want to elaborate?
No, I was just going to say, just simply look at the map, just reinforcing what Mary's saying, is there's different treatments in these different areas and different goals that have been attached to these areas. So I think it's likely that that'll be the case. And just knowing that this is, a potential area where to accommodate this development through the new interchange, through the access that's happening here. So looking to see how the form of that and mixing these uses and making that compact just by targeting the development to that area, there's a lot that goes into that just by knowing that that's the overall goal for this area. So
We have definitely heard from people who've talked about, Carol, I think it was some of the meetings we even had with the stakeholders, is there a way to actually sort of brand this entire Tri-Town interchange area as being a green, sustainable, compact community? And that's definitely something I think we will want to explore as we flesh out what the standards should be. How do you, there are studies now that people say, a lot of the emphasis today is focusing on LEED standards and, how do you make the buildings green? And there are additional studies, and there's a new group of standards, LEED ND, where people have said you can make the greenest, most high-tech building in the world, and if everybody has to drive to that building, you're going to use more energy with the transportation than you're going to save with all the techno that you put into the building. So what we want to do, and again, thinking of place, is how do you sort of marry the two?
This area is also on the Haverhill train line. Stan Franzine, who's in the audience tonight too, is the executive director of the Transportation Management Organization in the Lowell Junction area. And one of the things that we're looking for as part of this process too is an ability to include the TMO in our plans to help make this a more traveler-friendly, I guess, or easier to commute area, whether that's looking at a potential of a train stop there, looking at park and ride facility, looking at the potential for shuttles to existing transportation nodes, trying to cut down on trips certainly is one of the one of the strategies that we're going to need to look at in developing this whole area.
Forgive us for our ignorance here, but we're not versed at all as to what is going on. We are landowners, but we're out of town. And we did get a notification, and I was under the impression it was something to the effect that 93, this meeting was for the widening of 93. Perhaps I'm wrong or misunderstood.
It's part of the process.
Is that fastly coming, or?
What is supplying the, I'm not sure which is first, the chicken or the egg here, but several years ago, Tewksbury was approached to construct a mall on undeveloped land on the west side of Route 93. That supplied the impetus for the state to kind of get interested in another interchange in this area, something that the three towns had been talking about for a number of years. What it has evolved into at this point is that we are developing plans through Mass Highway and Federal Highway to have an interchange between Route 129, 125, I always do this, and Dascom Road, somewhere in the middle there. The exact location of the interchange is still being determined.
Here are the two intersections today.
Yep.
Putting the new interchange.
Roughly in
that
there.
approximate area.
We have another consulting firm, AECom, that Jeffrey spoke of earlier, who is preparing an environmental impact statement for the interchange development and for adding a fourth lane all the way to 495 as part of this project. Now, the widening, per se, as I understand it, is being proposed to happen in the median strip and not necessarily on the edges. So additional or substantial additional takings doesn't appear to be part of this process, although for the interchange itself and the ramps on and off, I'm sure that there will need to be land takings to accomplish that. I don't know whether that addresses your question or not.
Well,
Gets there?
there is live activity that there is going to be an interchange.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're working on a daily basis with Mass and Federal Highway to see this accomplished, because the only access to land on the west side of the highway right now is through the development of an interchange. The local road system, the only local road system into this area is South Street in Tewksbury, and there is substantial opposition to seeing that become a major thoroughfare. So how we get access to that land for economic development is part of this whole project.
And then part of what we're working on, we keep referring to the form-based code, is the idea when the interchange is open, you're going to have a lot of land accessible and available for development that today currently cannot be developed. What should the standards be for the area around the interchange? And I'm going to make a gross generalization, but from what we've heard so far, people have made it very clear in all three towns, they don't want it to be gas stations and fast food. And so, and big boxes. And so what we've been working from is this plan that was done about 2 years ago with the big concepts of it, different character areas. And so we're working then to actually draft very specific development standards called the form-based code for future development in this area, as well as designating some of it to be preserved as wetlands and green open space.
And those are two parallel efforts, but in a way, two separate but parallel efforts, where they're looking at the roadway interchange design, and we're reacting to the potential development and this mixed-use development vision that surrounds where that's being located, so happening at the same time. So you might see other meetings that are out there that have a focus on the interchange itself. Our primary focus is obviously on the development of the form-based code.
Do all four of you represent the town of Wilmington, or we got?
I'm the planning director in Wilmington, and the,
We're under
Consultant.
contract to all three towns.
right.
But we're
We're with-
consultants.
With the consultant team. Was there a question over here?
Between Dascom Road and Route 125, it seems like in the middle of it used to be an old railroad bed that went down to Rocco's dump out to South Street. Is that potentially what you're thinking of, the interchange being some,
Somewhere in that area?
yeah? Because the land that we own, 10 acres, abuts the railroad track going down between Rocco's dump and 93.
Okay. So your land right now is landlocked?
Yes.
Right.
We found it 50 years ago.
Okay.
In the town of Wilmington.
It's in the town of Wilmington, right? The only way into it though is through South Street,
Right,
down the old railroad bed to the land.
to the land right now, yep. That would be it. There's no way to get there from Wilmington proper.
No way to get there from Wilmington.
Was it part of a larger parcel at one point? or-
Yes, it was. It was part of Gillette. The farmer there owned probably 250 acres. My father got 10 acres from us working on the farm. That was 60 years ago, 70 years ago. And then my next door neighbor, he got 10 acres. So it was all one part of it at one time was Gillette, and that was before 93 was there.
I was gonna say, your parcel got separated when the highway went through.
We used to be able to drive from South Street right to, it was Patsy Nadoni and Tellini's farms back there. Once 93 went in, there was no more
No.
accessibility without going down through Salem Road and around the whole place.
May I ask I forget who asked the question, how do we see the land being used? What did Andover say? What do they see?
Well, do you want to start on that?
Sure. I mean, Andover raised a number of goals and aspirations and concerns last night. I mean, one is riverfront protection. They would like to see more public access, enhanced river walk, trails, things like that along that portion of the study area that abuts the Shawshene River. They are very concerned about retail use, particularly as it relates to competition with their downtown.
In that regard, if I could interject, the one phrase that I remember specifically they said was they wanted the area to complement
Complementary.
downtown Andover and not compete with downtown Andover.
They have a very vital existing downtown, and they want to make sure that whatever uses are proposed in the mixed-use district, that they complement their downtown. A lot of questions about the process of the form-based code. Is this an overlay district? Is it a new zone? Is it, how are we going to handle variances and waivers? How do we handle projects that cross town boundaries? Questions about lead and sustainability came up. The commuter rail and opportunities to work with the TMO in terms of expanding service and with shuttles and things like that. Questions about the governance of the form-based code. What happens if one town 5 years from now decides they don't want to play anymore?
Steps out of the sandbox.
How is that going to be addressed? These are all great questions, great legal questions that we need to obviously address. Will the form-based code result in more costly construction? Same question that you had. Great question. Will it price people out? Questions about 40B as well. Question about public safety facilities. Some of the same questions last night that we heard tonight. So those
There are a
were.
few questions about traffic and about how that's going to be looked at and addressed, traffic calming, access,
Right.
residential neighborhoods that are around the area as well, and how that ties back into the other parallel study that's looking at the traffic management and so forth, traffic access.
There was specific, one other one that I have here that I think you didn't mention, Ken, is the noise and the visibility from the highway and sort of how those pieces fit together and where the most intense development goes and what will be visible from the highway and what sort of character that will project for the whole area.
And will the buildings be oriented to the highway, or will they be oriented towards town? I mean, how, you see a lot of, we all have seen it right off the interstate, buildings that are there to take advantage of their proximity to the interstate and are not really part of the town. They're really sort of there to get right on, right off, and looking at the orientation of the buildings as well, they're very concerned about.
You mentioned one, if I may, and I thought of it early. Form-based, is it meant to replace our existing system of zoning, and we talked about overlay or whatever, and maybe I direct this directly at you, Karen. Does it complement our existing set of codes, or is it in place of, specifically for this region?
It's a different way of looking at zoning. So I get, and Mary, you may have to jump in and help me with this one too. I guess what I envision is that the form-based code for this area will replace what we currently have there. Again, that's an overlay versus underlying zoning question as well. If we do an overlay district in that area, then the underlying zoning can still be used. And I think in some places we have to be very sensitive to existing uses out there. On the west side of the highway, though, where Wilmington's vacant land is, I would think we would not want to do an overlay district there. I would think that that's vacant land. We'd want to zone it specifically for a particular use. Am I in the right direction, Mary?
Well, I'm not, well, there's two pieces to it. One is conceptually doing an overlay, if all the underlying zoning remains, are the towns setting themselves up for a dual system where developers, property owners can come in and say, where do I get the best deal? I want to stick with the old, or I want to go with a new system. So that's a trickier thing, I think, to manage. I think it's a more straightforward process if this just becomes a new district, a new set of standards, and the old standards go away. Legally, there may be issues, and I don't know the answer to that, I don't think any of us do yet, that there may be reasons to do it as an overlay because of state law or whatever, legal, or what makes the most sense for the three towns. But it's process, I think it's the cleanest if it can be a new set of standards for the new tri-town district, whatever it's going to be called, and it's very clear, these are the new standards, this is the new process, and this is the way it will be administered. The underlying zoning in this district right now is literally all over the map, from industrial to large acre residential to a retail overlay for a regional mall. So there's a lot on the ground right now out there that I think conceptually the towns don't necessarily want that to be the direction this goes in the future. So part of it is the sort of character, what's the place that the towns want it to be, but part of it is going to be legal process questions of what's the most direct way to get there.
Can I ask you to highlight timelines again? You blasted over it, I think, early in the slides, but I'd love to see that again.
So going forward from the few meetings that we're having this week is the couple of, we're calling them the charrettes. First one's on October 22nd. It's from 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock in the evening. That's going to be in Tewksbury Town Hall. That's where we'll be getting into the visioning, talking about the unified development vision, and setting the framework for a lot of the future steps. Because we're going from that.
That's gonna be a real work session. I mean, we're really, inviting people to come, we're gonna roll out plans, we're gonna get, specific on individual parcels, we're going to be testing different ideas. There'll be some presentation part of that, but it's really meant to be a community involvement, community engaged around the table, rolling up our sleeves and being planners and designers together.
And zooming in, we talked about the fact that the mixed-use plan, color-coded, is about 30,000 feet. For example, what we talked about, the green areas now that are marked as being saved as open space are really large. To do things like greenway paths, you can't even see them on a map that scale, because you can do a pedestrian connection, with 20 feet of space. So as we start zooming down to the ground, we'll be really looking at more specific, are there opportunities for connections between different areas so that someone could walk or ride their bike or that sort of thing. So we definitely have to move from that.
And the other thing too, if you go back to that, Jeffrey, just real quick, is that we like to say that that's 30 or 40,000 feet up in the air. We got to come down considerably to the parcels. There are multiple landowners on those colored parcels. There are wetlands. There are easements. There are utility lines. There's rare and endangered species. So that we need to understand what land is available for development, what's not, where is the interchange going to go. There are different alternatives right now. Which one should we be testing for purposes of our analysis, and really kind of get specific. And so that'll be the first charrette. I'm sorry.
And I think that the purpose of these two charrettes is knowing that we've got to go from that high level down. They're geared towards getting us to progressively more detail and refinements as we go through. And between the two charrettes, we're actually doing a lot of homework to prepare for the second one to get us to that greater level of detail. The overall goal here is that by the end of this year is to have consensus around this vision plan, more detail added to the vision plan, because it's not until you get to that, as we're calling this greater level of detail, and in some spots we may not be able to get to a greater level of detail. It may intentionally need to be a little bit more at the framework level. It's only until we get to that point that we can go and start drafting the form-based code. So the target for next year, early next year, January, February, is to start drafting the elements of the form-based code, be able to come back to the public, present that probably mid-February is what we're targeting, get some feedback, present it at the planning board hearing in mid-May, as the final code is what we're targeting in mid-May, so that you're leading into the summer months up to town meeting process. So I think by early summer, we want to have the form-based code finalized so that we can get into the prepping for town meeting process. So those are the real key events.
The three towns also have decided that a town meeting in October specifically for this purpose, obviously there may be other articles that join in, but this is going to be something entirely different for people to get their arms around. And so being able to have a town meeting that's almost exclusively this project and the new code, we feel that it's easier to prepare for, better for people to be able to focus on than trying to do it at the April annual town meeting. So the three towns have agreed that we'll try to do this in a fall town meeting.
Are you all Wilmington residents as well? No. Because I was just going to pose.
I'm Tewksbury, and Johnny's from Florida, and Philip's from New Hampshire.
Okay.
Three brothers
Okay.
that own the land together in Tewksbury. But I don't know if you have any developers interested in doing this project, but it looks to me like this project is going to have a real high technology class of people to develop it. And of course, the developer is going to develop it to make money, and it's nice if we can get some nice parks and some nice walkways and all. But I mean, there's no developer that come in and just cater to walkways and paths and bike paths and all that. And, but I'm a developer and a builder, but I would hate to ever get into a project like this. Because I don't see how anyone could make any money doing it.
Well, the one thing in that regard, I think, is for the study area, we're looking at, it's the Tri-Town Interchange Development Area. I believe, I'm safe in saying that no one is envisioning it as being a single developer coming in and doing it. The idea is to get the standards in place so that individual property owners or groups of property owners could then come in and say, these are the new rules. If we decide to develop, here are what the new standards are. So I think you're absolutely correct that this would be a huge undertaking for someone to try to do it as a single development. And the timeline, we're talking here, this is not after we get the code drafted and the towns adopt it, it's not like this is going to all turn around, in 18 months. This is a 20-year, a 30-year development. The interchange isn't anticipated for another 6 years down the road. So there are a lot of moving pieces that come into play.
I was going to ask one other question just for the benefit of for the Wilmington residents, which I guess is just one. This, and you've heard me say this many times before, this, in order for this to pass, it needs two-thirds vote at all three towns, which is going to be a challenge, a major hurdle that one needs to get over. And I was just going to throw the question out to you as a Wilmington resident. What do you see the biggest sort of hurdles from Wilmington's perspective that it's going, what is it going to take for Wilmington to get a two-thirds vote on something like this?
Communications, first thing. I think we started there, but that's not going to get them to vote in favor, but to get them to vote, get people engaged, involved, aware. Tonight is step one. I know there's been other events that have preceded this evening, but it's going to have to pick up pace and pick up momentum and get more visible. WCTV is great, and hopefully there are people watching now and that will watch repeatedly over the next couple of weeks or whatever when they rebroadcast. That's the advantage, is that we can hit a lot of people. The disadvantage is we don't have a great participation in this room tonight because I think there might be the inclination that people can just watch it. You can't engage in conversation over the television, however. And so somehow, some way, and I don't have the answer here, but the challenge will be over the next months to engage the residents of Wilmington in a one-on-one scenario. And I don't exactly know how to do that. Lots and lots of communication and participation of the press. Carol, that's, I think, probably falls a lot on your shoulders, and we as the selectmen can do our part to make sure that we state that this is coming and it's important. I think the nature of your question was, how do we get two-thirds of the attendees at town meeting, assuming we get a quorum, to vote in favor, to proceed and move forward? And I'm embarrassed to give you the most simplistic of answers. Show the advantage and assure those that would be concerned about negatives, whether they be environmental negatives or cost negatives or a combination of the both, assure them through data and whatever tools you have at your fingertips that the negatives will be far outweighed by the positive. And that's what I would need to hear. And I'm assuming that like-minded or reasonable thinking people that I would like to think Wilmington is filled with would vote accordingly. But you have your work cut out for it.
We like to think we have our work cut out for us. It's definitely, we want to see it happen. We believe in it. We wouldn't have wanted to do this project if we didn't think it was really, really important. But it's definitely all three towns pulling together and saying, you know, this is something we want to achieve, it will benefit all of us. You know, the priorities that Jeffrey outlined, where all three towns, I think, talked about, this is a chance for economic development, this is some of, you know, the last undeveloped land within the town boundaries, and so it's sort of, you don't want to miss this opportunity.
It's a pretty unique opportunity, but it's a pretty unique process to get you there too. So coupling the two together, it's going to be a very interesting process to go through.
I think that's also part of the challenge here, is that it's so new that, and maybe I've never been exposed to a process like this that involves multiple communities, that's this grand in potential scope, and that really demands the support of residents of their respective communities. And I think because it's kind of new and unfamiliar, that makes it even more challenging to get residents engaged in the process, which increases our challenge.
It is a very unique project. One, it's unique to have this much available land that's not already developed. We are represented by 3 different planning organizations, regional planning organizations, 3 different towns, 3 different MPOs, folks who will control the funds for the interchange itself. This is an incredibly unique opportunity.
So it also, I mean, it's both a challenge and an opportunity. I mean, it's the challenge is I agree with you, the newness of it makes it a challenge, but on the same hand, the fact that the 3 towns are all at the table, all the planners are all, you know, working together towards this, it's very unique, and it creates an opportunity that, you know, is really, you know, is quite amazing when you stand back and look at it. So. Are there other questions? I mean, there's, for those of you who came in late, if you've got any specific comments or concerns that you don't feel comfortable stating here, you can write it on a yellow Post-it and just stick it on the wall over here, which is just a collection of comments that we've gotten over the last 2 days. So.
And the board that says character, the question is not so much what is the character there today, but the interchange is built in 2016 and you were to come back to the Tri-Town area in 2020, what would you hope the character of the interchange area be?
Any other comments?
Well, thank you. I think
Okay, thanks.
it's, as we've been saying last night even, it's very helpful for us to hear the comments, understand where the questions lie, and get some feedback about the process and the pieces that we put together tonight. And hopefully we'll see you at some of the upcoming events. So look forward to seeing you there. Carol, did you have any other closing comments tonight?
No, I appreciate folks coming out tonight. I'm very grateful to Cable TV, Wilmington Cable TV, for coming in and taping this for us. This will help get the word out to folks and let folks know what the process is and where we're going from here. And look forward also to seeing you again at another event.
Thanks.